Let's dream together for a moment. The year was 2023. After decades of exploitation, hate violence, rising rent costs, global temperature increases, and dealing with disaster after disaster without any government relief, everyday Americans decided they were fed up. They started small, talking to their neighbors for once, and they quickly realized that not only did they have a common enemy in the form of climate collapse, they realized that they had all the skills and all the technology they needed to demand change. They decided enough was enough and threatened to stop the economy in its tracks in an attempt to get rich corporations and politicians to listen for once. Leaders stepped up in every town from sea to shining sea, stockpiling food, keeping track of who needed care and who would provide that care, planning fun events like block parties and concerts, buying generators so nobody would be left without power, and everything else they needed to make sure that everyone could be taken care of when their paychecks stopped coming. It wasn't perfect. We made a lot of mistakes along the way. Most of us didn't know what the country would look like on the other side of this, and there was a lot of infighting and struggle. But it worked. After only a month of nobody going to work, the government was brought down to its knees, begging for the machinery of American life as they knew it to keep churning. But we came with demands. No more rent increases, a freeze on evictions until further notice, a redistribution of wealth from the rich back to the people who earn them that wealth, and a reinvestment in climate tech and decarbonization. The world wasn't fixed overnight. It was messy. UBI checks came late, companies tried to use loopholes to get out of paying their share, and some were even successful. But because we were all unified and we finally had the financial freedom to focus our energy on collective action, we flipped the electoral system on its head, getting our people in charge and making even bigger changes. Decarbonizing our energy grid, moving away from fossil fuels, investing in green energy and public transportation, all under the leadership of Black and Indigenous folks who'd been screaming at us for decades about how to use the land and how to redistribute the wealth. After just a couple of years, it felt like we had it all. And it turns out the whole American exceptionalism thing wasn't a total farce after all. After everything went down, other countries used us as a model. Leaders from around the world stepped up and everyday people got their power back and won their own freedom. The climate labor revolution of 2023 went down in history as a turning point for the whole world. Doesn't that sound nice? Wouldn't you rather dream of possible futures instead of wallowing in doom? Here's the thing, folks. You don't need me to explain the severity of the climate crisis. If you've been paying any attention to climate-related news in the past 10 years, you already know that we are amidst something bad. The only development that's really new, at least to white Americans, is that climate change isn't a potentially bad thing on the horizon. It's here. Extreme temperatures are already leading to disruptions in the food supply chain through dead crops and farm animals who can't survive the heat. Deadly working conditions are everywhere, from UPS trucks to factory floors. Never mind the other effects of climate change, like ocean acidification, increased frequency of natural disasters, and total economic and social collapse. Climate change is here to stay, and it will get worse before it gets better. How does that make you feel? Does that make you feel terrified, hopeless, disempowered, gasping for air? Would you describe these scenarios as apocalyptic? What if I told you that there's a way out? That there is hope, that we can make the world a better place, that there are things we can do right now to build our resilience against climate change? Luckily, I know just the person who can give us a much-needed dose of hope.
So one of the things that we are calling for and advocating for is a general strike at the end of summer 2023.
Shré Jethwani is a New York City-based organizer, activist, and author. They're a passionate advocate for queer and trans issues, environmental restoration, and climate justice. And their new book is a step-by-step guide for how we can flip the system on its head and start a climate labor revolution.
There currently right now across the country is such a long-standing pattern of abuse of the working people and the working class that the rumblings calling for a general strike reach far and wide, from Amazon labor union leaders to Starbucks workers union leaders. The farm workers in California right now are protesting, marching across the entire state. So labor right now in America, striking, unionizing, and organizing is the sleeping giant. And truly America's working class serves these elite who treat us with just recklessness. I don't think they understand just how many of us there are.
Welcome, dear viewer, to Rule 63, the transfeminist podcast where we outline the barriers to ending systemic oppression and where we imagine better futures for ourselves. So, without further ado, my name is Anna Marie, PhD, and welcome to Rule 63. This episode has content notices for climate change, racial injustice, and homophobia. You're probably wondering how we can even begin to build the political power we need to strike and decarbonize our country. The answer lies in our numbers. 91% of Democrats said that they are very or somewhat concerned about climate change, and even nearly half, 47% of Republicans, said the same. Over half of Americans, 57%, believe climate change is mostly caused by human activity, and 62% of Americans say that climate change is affecting their local community either a great deal or to some degree. It's not the only issue we have majority consensus on either. 61% of Americans agree that abortion should be fully legal, 64% of Americans support legal protections for trans people, 68% of Americans support universal health care. By a simple majority, most of our heads are in the right space for some major political shifts. So why haven't we seen that translated into actual action? Well, there are lots of reasons for that, which we'll get into, but perhaps the biggest reason is that politicians aren't accountable to public opinion, which they are supposed to be in a democracy. It's weird that I have to remind people about that. Policies that allow for things like racial gerrymandering or the filibuster, and rich corporations being able to sway public policy through lobbying and campaign donations mean that a rich conservative minority holds immense power.
I mean, there's so much going on consistently. It's really funny. It's in that, you remember how every election, they're like, this is the most important election of your life. And it's like, is it the most important election of my life because it is the most important one so far? Or is it because things are getting worse? Right?
This is why we're all totally disillusioned with the idea of working within the electoral system.
I think we can all agree that the state of trans rights and in America is in shambles. It's on its way to rapid decline. We have so much that we have to counter right now as a community. And then beyond that, we have climate and we have the rising tide of fascism. And these are all interspersed with every other issue that we have going on in alignment right now. Climate is being funded by big oil, which is being seduced by the allure of fascist elements because of business benefits that gives them kickbacks, and it cyclically feeds itself.
There's a lot of work to be done, but we can do that work. In their new book, which you can read for free on their website, peoplesgeneralstrike.com, link in the description, Shré and their co-author Savannah Gribbins argue that we need to give political power back to the people.
Well, I mean, one of the things that we're talking about in the book is, the notion of a government that functions because the people vote a certain way, the government is going to act a certain way. And I think that is the most incredible lie that's ever been sold to us as the American people. Because if you look back at it, never has voting directly yielded the results. Electeds always follow the will of electors. It wasn't because more people voted that we got the civil rights movement passed. Let me be clear, that doesn't mean that voting itself is useless. Voting for people who are not bought and paid for creates the conditions for those electeds to follow the will of the electors. That's where the channel is blocked right now. It has never been in American history that the electeds feel the need to like gung-ho do something until public pressure mounts to an extent that they feel obligated to.
But what does it mean to escalate the public pressure on politicians? Lots of groups have been publicly protesting for years, but it feels like all the usual means of making your voice heard, from voting to marches to petitioning, don't really work anymore.
We're talking about accountability, but it's also, they should feel shame. I think shame is such a powerful tool that historically the masses have used to make sure that the elite who have governing power actually do things that benefit the masses. I think it's good when we harass Supreme Court justices out of their dessert. What's that? There's that like one TikTok audio that like lives in my head rent free. It's like, if you're going to be tough, or if you're going to be stupid, you got to be tough. And it's like, if you're going to be a Supreme Court justice who's trying to undo like centuries of clawed for hard fought wins, you got to be tough. Okay.
Shré explains that a lot of the protest tactics that we're familiar with are rooted in the assumption that politicians respond to shame.
If you think about it like as a pyramid, the first foundation is that, you know, the politician has to be led by the electorate. We can't wait for them to act first. We have to be consistently, proactively lobbying, demanding, etc. If we're working off of that foundation, then the next step up from there is that we need to have robust voting, right? If we are leading them, then we need to be participating in the system. We understand that the system is flawed and does not work. If we're going through history and we're building this pyramid based off of what we have seen and go back to movements that worked, we look at things like hunger strikes, the salt marches that Mahatma Gandhi led in India to, successfully demonstrate the brutality of the British. You look at the civil rights movement. You look at Bloody Sunday. You look at the Montgomery bus boycott. Identifying themes across all of these movements, we realize that inconveniencing the folks who have power is the only way to disturb them enough to get things moving.
Staged civil disobedience doesn't really work when politicians have no direct financial reason to obey the public. It's been said many times that today's politicians are shameless, and Shré definitely agrees.
With the salt marches in India, it was demonstrating the brutality of the British who were beating these innocent people who were just walking to the beach. That worked because the whole world saw the newspaper articles about it, and everyone was clutching their pearls, and the British were embarrassed. And that's why it worked. But if we move past a point where that embarrassment no longer works, then those tactics become outdated, right? They worked, but that doesn't mean that they're going to continue to work, because we can't assume that our opponent isn't going to advance as we advance as well. So the third piece of that pyramid is that we have to not extrajudicially, but like extra of the voting system, be operating in a way that organizes around our priorities. And for that, we got into the tactics that have been successful in disruption.
So if shame doesn't work anymore, we need to rely on another common element of past political movements, that being disruption, especially financial disruption.
Financial disruption is incredibly powerful. Financial disruption is directly tied also to another way of freezing other people's ability to, rich people's ability to utilize their wealth that's stored in the stock market by doing a run like the run on GameStop. That was organized, right? If you think about organizing, it's not just knocking on doors and making people go out to vote.
What we saw in 2020 was that the economy can be brought to its knees if everyone stays at home. After a pandemic caused initial market shock and skyrocketing unemployment, the government floated the idea of a temporary basic income plan, and while it wasn't nearly enough, the government even sent out a few stimulus checks. This is proof that the greatest power we have is our labor, specifically the power to withhold our labor when we're not getting what we want.
We want to tie the financial, putting financial pressure on the wealthy. One way to do it is striking also, right? So we have the GameStop run, we have striking, because just walking off the job inconveniences them so much. The like Lucille Bluth, what is it? It's a banana. How much could it cost? $10? Like, a lot of the elite do not live in the real world, do not have like a tangible touch on reality. And these folks think that they're rugged individualists. They think that everything gets done by themselves. And so if you were like a Starbucks union that got fired for unionizing, a Starbucks union leader that got fired for unionizing their location, and all of a sudden folks in that community aren't able to get their morning coffee, that pissing them off does so much damage for the corporation, because the person who is inconvenienced can't really blame the worker because they too are in a rush to go to work. But if you're inconveniencing wealthy elites, right, if we were to do a general strike at a point in time where all of these folks would be unable to get their morning coffee or unable to operate in the economy the way that they normally do with reckless abandon, because the working people say we're fed up, we need a break until we get these demands met. That is a powerful, powerful tool that has successfully won entire countries their rights.
All this in mind, it makes sense that labor strikes have become increasingly popular in the past 2 years. Everyday Americans are realizing that the political actions that have been sold to them aren't enough, and that through labor organizing, they can get some serious wins.
But I also really want to say that when we say organizing, what people think of is the most commercialized, bastardized, broken version of organizing. True organizing is building community and talking to people and like building consensus and building power through communication and relationships. What the Democratic Party and the current electoral system has done is shrunk down organizing to basically pushing people out at the end and begging them to vote for their party, rather than building lasting relationships that work hand in hand in the legislating process after the elections are over. So when we're organizing, we can do it outside of the electoral system to organize power by doing these actions ourselves.
While a complete history of strikes as a labor tactic is beyond the scope of this one episode, there are lots of examples of strikes throughout history that we can learn from. Perhaps the most famous example in recent history of a nation's economy being taken out completely was the 1968 general strike in France, known as May 68. A 2-week period of civil disobedience throughout the country, starting with student protests against capitalism and ending with left-wing victories and a cultural revolution that still impacts French society to this day. Even unsuccessful strikes are worth learning about, since the tactics used by companies and governments to destroy labor movements are ubiquitous and need to be accounted for. There's so much literature out there on how to unionize and information about past strikes, some of which I'll include in the description. For example, there's a great series by small YouTuber Alki about some of the biggest general strikes in American history, what they got right, what they did wrong, and what we can learn from them. For now, it's worth pointing out that despite union membership being at a low point right now, we're still seeing a huge rise in worker strikes in the past couple of years. In October 2021, about 140,000 US workers were participating in or preparing for strikes around the country, an event so monumental that news organizations dubbed it Striketober. And as I write this episode, we're seeing even bigger shifts, from the HarperCollins strike in the publishing industry to the Starbucks Red Cup Rebellion, awesome name by the way, to the potential for a rail workers strike that could start any day now. Workers are already mobilizing for pay increases, healthcare, and yes, climate action. I guess that means we're in Strikevember, and I hope that lasts into Don't Work December and Just Don't Cross the Picket Line January, and so on and so forth. One movement that's particularly inspiring for me is the graduate and postdoctoral workers' strike within the University of California school system. At time of recording, we are 3 weeks into the largest strike in the history of the American education system, with 48,000 graduate teaching and research assistants, graders, readers, and postdoctoral workers across 9 campuses withholding their labor. They're striking for an increase in grad student pay that matches the high cost of living in California, which basically comes to a $54,000 a year salary, but could vary depending on the city. Basically, they're fighting for a livable, middle-class income that any worker deserves. Other demands include defunding the UC police system, rights for international students, and yes, climate action through transit upgrades like free bus passes and subsidies for the purchase and maintenance of bikes and e-bikes. I could make a whole other episode on this, and gosh darn it, maybe I will, but universities often treat grad students awfully, underpaying them under the excuse that they're doing an apprenticeship, not a job. Without the help of graduate employee unions, the laws that apply to grad students are almost always written in a shady way. Basically, you're an employee when it's convenient for the university, and you're a student when it's convenient for the university. The real feat of the UC strike is in its scale. 48,000 people from all across California, unifying people from all ideologies and unifying everyone from STEM majors to humanities majors, who each have a different responsibility in the university and different job prospects after graduation. These largely aren't people with a history of labor organizing either. They're people from all over the political spectrum coming together for the common cause of fair treatment. There's even been a ripple effect. Some of the construction workers who were working on a new building at UC Berkeley stopped working on it, and UPS workers stopped delivering packages to some campuses, all in solidarity with the grad student and postdoc workers. Proof that one movement can inspire many. If you're skeptical about the possibility for a national climate strike and you need a tangible example of a statewide coalition all acting in unison, go follow some of the strikers on social media or scroll through the hashtag FairUCNow. This story is still developing live, and I truly hope they're successful. Unfortunately, the university is engaging in shady union-busting practices, like threatening the legal status of grad students who are here on student visas, essentially threatening to deport them and their families. And as bargaining with the UC administration continues, the actual end result will probably be less than what the strikers are demanding, and might impact different fields differently. For example, if grad student pay goes up across the board, STEM departments might be fine, but humanities departments might not fund as many TA-ships in future years. The turnout of the strike might be messy, but even if every single demand isn't met, the true accomplishment will be in the activation and mobilization of thousands of workers, and in inspiring workers around the world to fight for better working conditions and climate solutions.
And so I know it's easy to slip into feeling overwhelmed, but it's like at the end of the day, these issues present us with a choice and an occasion to rise to. It is up to us, because the amount of time has run out. It's up to us to kind of step up and demand that we fix all of these things. So many of these issues are snowballed from years of, oh, we can't deal with this because it's interlocked with that, which is interlocked with a third issue. And so we just kind of let it snowball into a worse and worse state. That's kind of what we've seen. That's entirely what we have seen happen with the rising tide of fascism and that unholy alliance with big business and how that kind of feeds into itself. It's about knowing what we are worth and demanding it, and making sure that everyone understands that it's up to us to get it. No one else is going to give it to us. But if we all work together in tandem, anything is possible, truly.
So Shré's plan is this. On August 1st, 2023, the nation will go on strike, holding the economy hostage until the ruling class agrees to save the planet. Why next summer? This is all about preparing for the next big general election in November 2024. Imagine for a moment local organizers and politicians working in tandem rather than independently from one another.
You have a word of mouth trusted network that you can utilize to tell folks, okay, we have this lead problem in our neighborhood. so and so, our friend who lives in this apartment, is actually going to run for like the neighborhood seat on the city council. So we all have to go like organize for them, because these are the things that we want the city commission to pass around undoing the lead pollution. And our neighbor is going to sponsor them. So we're all going to rally around our neighbor. So it's those two things working in tandem, where you have the electoral system getting us the capacity for what we want done there, and the people leading the folks who are in the electoral system so that it's getting done.
In their book, Shré outlines a key strike demand being a year of rest, a full calendar year devoted to economic maintenance and improving people's material conditions. This involves a national eviction moratorium, a national mortgage payment freeze, and a national rent freeze so that housing is guaranteed. And it'll involve a $2,000 a month income for every taxpayer, which will eventually become a universal basic income program. Once we pull off the strike, the year of rest will help us build even more political power within our communities so that we can get strike-friendly politicians at local, state, and federal levels. After the 2024 election, we can achieve even bigger goals, everything from ending the legal loopholes that let big corporations skirt responsibility to the people and the planet, to giving the land back to indigenous communities.
That is changeable. It's not going to be easy, and we have to understand that the game is rigged against us, but we can force them to behave in the interests of the electorate by shaming them, by striking, by using, organizing to ensure that, like, as we move along, we are securing victories through things outside of just voting, and then organizing at the right time to redraw gerrymandered maps. Make sure that if we can like pack the court, if that's something that's possible through political will, as a result of our demonstrated power through the general strike, I'm all here for it. Right? Things that are going to need fixing are going to constantly be emerging. So the more organized we are, the better we are prepared to kind of deal with them. It's very, entropy is the law of the universe, and it's our job to like roll that boulder back up that mountain every single day.
If this whole thing sounds like a lofty, pie-in-the-sky idea, that's because it is. But remember, if even just 10% of the people who voted in the 2020 presidential election joined the general strike, it would be the largest in history.
And all of this is what the majority of the people want. It is time for us to get into alignment. And our book hopes to kind of condense it all into a nice little 120 to 150 page kind of paperback or ebook that you can just consume really easily and feel equipped. In organizing, being equipped with the knowledge is the first place to start, because anyone can organize. Organizing is as simple as calling 5 of your friends on election day and telling them to go vote, or telling people to look after their community members by restocking the community food pantry or the local little lending library. Organizing is building community. And so starting with the smallest building blocks of organizing, we have done so much in this country. We can rapidly scale to build the power we need to demand the change that we want and implement it in real time.
When we come back from a short break, we're going to take this conversation a bit deeper. How do we get to the point when we're ready for a national general strike? What skills and relationships do we need to start building today to get ready for this movement? What are some of the potential roadblocks we might face along the way? All of that and more after the break. Rule 63 is independently funded and brought to you in part by listeners like you. If you like what you're hearing and you want to hear even more sweet, sweet content from me, Anna Marie, and my co-producer Danny, you can give us just a couple dollars a month on Patreon to get access to loads of bonus content. Included in that content is the full uncut interview with every guest we've ever had on the show, including my conversation with Shré used in this very episode. If you've been on the fence about supporting the show financially, it only gets better with every episode. Danny and I also do regular live streams where you can discuss your thoughts on this month's topic with us. If that sounds fun to you, or if you just want to support the show out of the goodness of your own heart, head on over to patreon.com/rule63. The link will be in the show notes. Thanks so much. Now, let's get back to the show. As an abolitionist, my personal politics are informed by radical optimism. This optimism is pretty well embodied in two quotes from abolitionist thinkers. Angela Davis tells us that you have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time. And Ursula K. Le Guin tells us that you cannot buy the revolution. You cannot make the revolution. You can only be the revolution. It is in your own spirit, or it is nowhere. But perhaps not everyone shares my level of radical optimism. I'm sure a lot of people listening to the episode so far are skeptical of this plan, especially given the time frame of the plan. How can we possibly do all of this within the next year? And I get it. I'm an engineer. I was trained since the beginning of my own schooling to be a practical thinker. A strike isn't as simple as everyone skips work and parties for a couple weeks. Like I said at the top of the episode, people need food, medicine, medical care, especially the elderly and those with disabilities. We'll need childcare and electricity in case the energy monopolies decide to switch off people's power as punishment for their refusal to work. Even though strikes are sometimes necessary to secure long-term labor rights, strikes often lead to retaliatory punishments in the short term for those partaking in the strikes, especially those leading them. Those who do get fired will need housing and other forms of support until they can get back on their feet. It'll take a massive amount of organization and stockpiling of resources, which America hasn't seen at this scale before. Lots of activist thinkers have discussed how Americans have been systematically de-skilled under industrial capitalism. We don't know how to check in on our neighbors, we only know how to call the police to do it for us. We don't know how to grow our own food because we've outsourced all that to farmers in the food and beverage industry. We don't know how to do CPR, conflict resolution, or many of the other things we need to know how to do when organizing a lot of people towards a common cause, mainly because of the industrialization of the public education system. This will take a lot of work. But when I close my eyes and dream about what kind of future I want to be in, the most important aspect of my vision is a sense of community.
Our aligning movement, as we build the language around it and we start to really deploy it in conversation, the folks who are not directly naysayers, but they're invested because they like the vision that we present, because it's a future worth living in, and it's a future it's one that we're not just subsisting in, we're thriving in. And so everyone wants in on that, and a lot of folks will come to us with different roadblocks around logistics or the actual tactics or the actual, like, it sounds great, we can talk to people, but how do I talk to someone in middle America? Or how do I talk to someone and convince them, to like unbecome a Trump person or whatever? And it's like, we're not trying to do everything all at once entirely, even though it may seem that way. But starting with those conversations, I think that people don't realize how many of us there are. And that is the first part of this, running the numbers to identify just how many working people there are and how we really have the numbers on getting what we want electorally and through external organizing, but not through either alone. It's, and I think it starts with, like, do you know your neighbors' names? Let's start there. That's a good place to start. If we're going to try striking within a year and have built community to where we're working together in alignment, let's everyone start, learn your neighbors' names, and then go from there. Start, like, we're not saying that you have to become besties with everyone who lives around you, but like, start knowing your people, knowing the people around you. Don't let the isolationist geography and architecture of American capitalism prevent you from that, because it is built that way. So do your best.
This is the biggest hurdle for a lot of people. When we talk about mutual aid, it sounds like this big, scary new thing that's never been done before. But you've probably been doing mutual aid for a while amongst your circle of friends without even knowing it, making sure someone has soup when they get sick, trading around at-home COVID tests when you need to, or even just borrowing a cup of sugar or a gardening tool.
Right. And it's like, I feel like if we're like definitionally, right, if we're saying that most Americans don't have a concept of community, I feel like that's like a good example place to start. It's there, right? It's that old, oh, can I borrow a cup of sugar kind of thing.
It'll take a lot of imagination and coordination to look at everyone's skills and tools and decide what role they can play in building the future. But despite the descaling done to us by capitalism, I believe that we can overcome it.
There are plenty of younger folks or folks who are willing to retool their skills to work in transfer to work in other like new emerging green sectors. But we can't expect that everyone is going to be able to. And we have to make sure that as we are rapidly making these changes to the way that we live, no one is getting left behind. And that ties right back into like, it starts with the community building now, knowing your neighbors, making sure everyone's stocked up on enough like food and goods for the general strike, which down the road becomes having a community that's strong enough to send folks to Congress and all of, do the representative part of organizing and do the like work part of organizing and reaping the benefits from it.
It all just comes down to getting to know your neighbors, what specific issues are affecting them, and what you can do to help each other.
It's about building like a real network of people. You yourself don't have to know everyone who lives on your block, but if you have like a hub and spoke, if you are a hub with 7 spokes and each of those folks have their own other like web of relationships with other people in the block or on the block or in the neighborhood, right? That's what starts to build that like fibrous network.
If you're like me, you're probably also thinking about plain old bigotry. There's no guarantee that when you knock on your neighbor's door, they'll even be accepting of your skin color or gender, never mind be willing to organize for a national strike with you. The last few decades of American politics have assured us that not everyone is going to be on our side. And if you've watched literally any movie or read pretty much any book about apocalyptic scenarios, you probably believe that as soon as things get really rough, we're all just gonna eat each other alive. Shows like The Walking Dead feed us fantasies about stockpiling food and guns and living in small nomadic tribes, killing anyone who gets in our way. But is this reality? Will we actually go Walking Dead mode if there's some big climate catastrophe in the next few years? Anthropologists say, not really. If you look at cases like New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, Houston after Hurricane Harvey, or Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, we see that time after time, communities tend toward helping each other when the going gets rough. Human beings are collaborative, creative, and social by nature. The division in society is something that's done to us by systems. If we don't, the consequences are dire. In her book, The Shock Doctrine, Naomi Klein talks at length about how disasters are often the nexus events by which corporations weaken the public sector in favor of private interests. But it doesn't have to be this way. If we're proactive and act under a philosophy of disaster collectivism, we can support one another when apocalyptic scenarios happen. So I'm not saying necessarily, hey, go out to talk to your homophobic MAGA neighbors, it'll be fine. Especially since, remember, we don't need every single American bigot on board in order to stop the economy. My position in recent years has been this. Spending your time trying to de-radicalize alt-right shitheads is a noble goal, to be sure, and definitely incumbent on the most privileged among us, but the whole working class is sitting right there. They're not perfect, everyone has pre-existing biases of some kind, but they're all just waiting to be mobilized into action. If it helps, just think about how good it's going to feel when we finally win.
Organizing is terrible. All of these things are such contradictions. It's just literally organizing is terrible because the way that it's set up right now, consuming all of that will burn you out. But it's the real meaningful interactions that you have with people that like reaffirms the vision and the like possibility of the vision. So it's like it'll restore itself. We just have to shovel the shit for a little while and the rewards will be well worth it. What we're hoping to do through this alignment, when we do it successfully, will will showcase so many incredible members of your own neighborhood, right? Like, it's not going to be just like oh, this congressperson or that governor or this city commissioner. It's going to be the folks who, if you are your neighborhood's block captain for organizing this strike, it's going to be like, wow, they did such a good job. Like, they were the person who made sure everyone had food on the table and whatever else. These local organizers who are actually the nexuses of power in our system are like the unsung heroes, the folks who like actually are going to be the keystone part of getting this done, are who are going to be recognized most by their communities. And there is something incredibly powerful in that. And if we think about that in just the sense of community, there's so much power in it, because creating leaders within a community reflects a healthy, atmosphere where people feel comfortable trusting someone to protect their interests and advocate for them. In an electoral sense, if in every neighborhood in America there are people like this stepping up, all of a sudden it gets so much harder and so much more expensive for big corporations to buy and sell positions of elected power like they're nothing, because you have an activated electorate, you have an activated advocacy class that's ready and willing to run for office.
Alternatively, I can remind you of what happens when we do nothing and fail to collectively organize in an intersectional fashion. Not to keep dragging on, but do you find hope in the new climate bill that was passed?
No. It was written by Exxon. I personally do not see how opening up 10 years worth of oil and gas leases, the size larger than the size of the Gulf of Mexico, is a win for the climate, when the climate scientists are telling us that we need to stop burning fossil fuels entirely, like yesterday. Here's a statistic. If we were to drive every single car on the road in the world today to the end of its usable life, we would so far overshoot the possibility of a livable planet. So drastic times call for drastic measures, truly.
This brings us to another roadblock we might face: the state of climate technology and its relationship to labor policy. A lot of decarbonization skeptics, including lots of engineers, will tell you that the technology just isn't there yet. Solar panels aren't efficient enough, batteries need to be able to store more energy for solar and wind to be viable options, so on and so forth. But others argue that we already have all the technology that we need. We just have to invest in the technology while taking radical action elsewhere to help with decarbonization.
We put a person on the moon with like the power of like a TI-84 calculator, right? So if we're talking about shutting down air travel for a few years while we find a way to electrify it or to at least decarbonize it, if we're talking about, is there a way to rebuild the entire North American power grid around nuclear and renewable power plant and technologies that already exist that is cheaper than non-renewables? Yes, we can. All of that technology exists. We have the capacity to scale it. We have the money to scale it. Everything that we are calling for in our book, and this is what gives me hope, everything that we are calling for is based off of existing technologies, off of things that we can do within budgets that we already spend. We've spent billions of dollars on jets that are supposed to take off vertically for like a decade or something. And that money could easily clean up pipes across America, could cap methane spouts that literally are leaking methane and other greenhouse gases into the air uncapped. And the government pays corporations for the privilege of them polluting. There are so many inherent loopholes that are just like, let's just close them up. Let's just do literally the bare minimum of things that we are capable of doing at scale. And we have a really good shot. Again, I could probably do a whole other episode on this, but
We already have solar farms, which can be built in half the time as fossil fuel plants and are more profitable. Wind farms, rooftop solar, geothermal, hydroelectricity, heat pumps, and lots of other technologies already being implemented around the country. The biggest hurdle in using renewable energy sources is energy storage technology, for which we already have batteries, which literally get better every year and will get better even faster if we invest our money into research, as well as hydroelectric dams, compressed air storage, and lots more. Even at the industrial level, we can use arc furnaces, induction furnaces, resistance furnaces, and many more methods of heat exchange. Hot take, the technology exists. We just need to ramp up our investments in research and in revamping our infrastructure. There's also the fact that maybe we don't even need a bunch of fancy new technologies in every town in America. Low-tech solutions like terracotta heat exchangers and indigenous farming practices that produce far less carbon and don't require pesticides are also available to us. Just to level with you for a moment, if the advice I've been giving so far in this episode about how to get started with activism has sounded a bit vague, that's because I don't live where you live. The principles of design justice, a body of ideas that are critical to intersectional transfeminism, remind us that we need to be in our own bodies, in our own spaces, and in our own contexts. For example, a technology that's best suited for New York City, like vertical farming, might not be suited for or even necessary in more rural areas. Design justice principle number 10 also reminds us that before looking for new solutions, we can look at what's already working at the community level, especially uplifting traditional, indigenous, and local knowledge and practices. There might already be people in your own town working on rewilding projects. No need to reinvent the wheel, babe. This is where our imaginations come in. We don't need every American to drive an electric car. We need most Americans to start taking electric buses and trains. Let this also be a regular reminder that we have enough food and housing for the whole country and then some. We just don't distribute it well and punish people for dumpster diving. Capitalism is the problem, not a lack of technology. Also, if you need proof that we can rapidly scale up the production of climate technology, look no further than every war this country has ever been in.
We can phase out air travel. We can safely land good, high-paying jobs for unionized airline pilots, for airline staff, like all of those, the folks who work in the cabin, the folks who work at the gate, the flight attendants, the pilots, all of those are transferable jobs to a robust high-speed rail industry. And to say it hasn't been done before, the airline industry, Pan American Airlines, was born of the American government creating a pilot class for World War II. We have the capacity of creating a high-speed rail operator class that is unionized, high-paying, transfer people who already work in the airline industry to these jobs, decrease the risk of cancer that they have. Most people who work on or in planes have such elevated risk of cancer because of the chemicals they're exposed to. We can do so much to better these people's lives, give everyone good, high-paying jobs.
Entire industries have been created or destroyed just because the government said so. If we channeled the same energy into climate policy that we channeled into a war and created a climate economy that mirrored our wartime economy, I have zero doubt that we could have solar panels on every American home and a driver for every hydrogen-powered bus within the decade. All of this serves a pretty great counter-narrative to Republican talking points about creating jobs and being a global leader. And what we could actually be telling people is, if we can pull this off and invest in climate tech, America could actually be number one. Yeah, if we can do this, we could save the world, or at least our country.
No pressure. Yeah, no pressure.
No
well,
pressure.
That's the other thing. The beauty of this is that, like, we, the American people, have the power to not only cause this transformation to happen, but if America all of a sudden divests from oil, first of all, the people around the globe are not dumb. They will be watching. They watch our elections. They watch our politics. They watch our legislation. If all of a sudden divesting from oil becomes financially smarter, a lot of countries will start to divest from oil. A lot of countries will start, in an ideal world, this kicks off the 21st century version of a global arms race towards green carbon zero within the decade, right? Everyone competing to outpay their smartest scientists, to give the most benefits to the people who are building the high-speed rails, to attract the best paid worker and give the worker the best benefits across the globe, across all of these markets. Put that into work with treating the worker correctly, putting that into work with building a planet that is sustainable, and put that against the ego measuring of international diplomacy, and you have a Cold War towards a future worth living in.
I'm by no means saying we need to lean into racist, far-right imperialist rhetoric about making America great again, but any attempt at a populist climate lamer movement probably has to be more accessible to the American public than shouting about arcane leftist theory.
In the same way, it's like the United States is this like giant imperial power. It's like, what if we use that for good? What if we just kind of stopped polluting, like literally killing ourselves, and led a trend of stopping that globally? Outsource our greenification to other countries. Let's sell our technology to other countries. There's so much that all of these politicians love to like rhetoric about like rebuilding American jobs and all of this, that, and the other. We can do that. We can do all of this, and a lot of people bring up the like, okay, we can do a lot of new jobs, but like, what about the coal worker in Virginia? Like, what do we do when the coal plant is done and they're like in their 50s? It's like, let them retire early. Just put them on UBI and let them retire early. Make sure that they have benefits because they've been breathing in coal dust, and let them just, there's an entire generation of overworked Americans that like, yes, our working force needs to be like large enough to sustain the country, but like there are things that can be automated. And like, if we're downsizing coal and like non-renewable based jobs, let's give those folks the dignity of at least like the rest of their lives. I think that that's something that's part of our solution that I think is so important. It's, let's give people the dignity that they deserve as part of the work that we are doing.
And if all else fails, as a last resort, we can always appeal to male fragility. Are you saying that we should just appeal to machismo to get our climate change passed?
Listen, if it works, appealing to machismo has gotten all of us our fair share of free beverages at the bar. Maybe it could get us our fair share of a future worth living in. International diplomacy is simple. It's that at scale.
Finally, perhaps the biggest thing stopping us is just plain old hopelessness. Doomerism is the black pill of climate despair, the idea that we're all, doomed. The current political system isn't going to stop climate change, so we might as well lay down and rot. It's the apocalypse, baby. Nothing we can do. I'm not the first to point this out, but this is actually somewhat of a privileged take. In every Rule 63 episode, we have a surprise, it's white supremacy segment. This is that segment. Plenty of other cultures have faced apocalyptic scenarios before. Indigenous people faced an apocalypse when colonizers came to this country, started murdering them, and forced them off their land. African people faced an apocalypse when those colonizers started stealing and enslaving human beings. Jewish people faced an apocalypse during the Holocaust, and like throughout most of their history too, a pretty big chunk of their religion is just, remember that we suffered, but we persevered anyway. Disabled and immunocompromised people are living through an apocalypse right now as the coronavirus pandemic rages on. And I hope I don't need to remind you of the concept of environmental injustice, the reality that marginalized people, especially people of color, will face the worst effects of climate change, thanks to hundreds of years of racist policies and economic marginalization, leaving them physically rooted in the place that are most vulnerable to heat waves, rising tides, etc. Of course, climate change will affect literally everyone on the planet, just some more than others. Doomerism is just what happens when white, economically privileged people are facing an actual threat for the first time. Losing hope is really easy when you don't have a legacy of perseverance to pull from.
I think, apocalypse is not inevitable. And I think that that's part of where we, root and plant our feet when we're doing this work. Because if you go into it every single day thinking about, geez, we have to like stop the end of the world. And also there's all of this other stuff going on. And like, I have my own life to live too. Planting and rooting your feet and like, it's not inevitable. And just starting there, breathe in and out. We have 1,000 days, 1,200 days ish to organize a future that is livable in. And that may seem like a lot and that may seem like a little at the same time, but it is a time frame that we can do things in a reasonable way with existing technology, with funds that already are diverted to heinous other projects by our government. But that's a whole, like, forget other podcasts, probably other series.
I normally start these episodes talking about my guest in more detail, but I saved Shré's activist backstory until right now to really drive this point home.
For me, I think probably like I realized I knew I was not straight early on, like very young as a child, but like I didn't have the language to go about like identifying it, naming it, and also like I didn't feel a need to kind of name it either. It was just there.
Shré grew up as a queer South Asian person in the Deep South, and that experience meant they had to often step up for themselves in the face of adversity.
So being brown to begin with, going to any space, you're already likely going to be one of one or two max in the room. So advocating for yourself and your space and like understanding being othered was just such a familiar reality. And so then from there, like advocating for yourself in like navigating such social situations became a way that I like learned negotiating skills and like stuff like that. And that like later translated into me being like just a loud middle schooler. What my actual early entry point into like all of the work and everything is like pinpoint to this one moment in time where I was speaking very loudly over someone who was presenting at 4-H club. We had an environmental club and my teacher pulled me aside. I thought I was going to get in trouble. And he was like, "You have a very loud voice. Have you ever tried a public speaking competition?" And I was like, "No, I haven't. Will this get me out of getting in trouble?" And so I did the public speaking competition on behalf of our club, ended up winning. And it was about like, what is the best land use in the state? And how can we like 4-H stuff, right? How can we better the state? Let's talk about water, all of that kind of stuff.
She's had a long history with being involved with activist movements and political campaigns, which you can hear about over on Patreon. But one of her earliest experiences was trying to start a GSA at their high school in Florida.
When I say advocating for ourselves, it's like I was one of 3 out kids at our high school when I was a freshman. The other 2 were 4 out kids. The other 2 were juniors and there was 1 senior. And so the 2 juniors and I decided that we were going to start a gay straight alliance, and the school district refused. So then we figured out that the ACLU could help us. And then the ACLU threatened to sue the school district. The school district was like, "Okay, fine, let's go to court," and then realized that they'd be bankrupt within like 6 months because they couldn't afford all of the legal fees. So they gave us our gay straight alliance. So, it's like advocating for yourself. That's like political action in real time. But we just wanted our little club, and it's like, so organizing, I feel, is innate to queer people, to folks who are regularly othered, folks who have to like consistently advocate for themselves, because advocating for others and like the empathy of like understanding the plight of others comes from that understanding of like what is going on with me, my community, seeing and recognizing that experience is shared by other communities, empathizing with them, and then organizing with them to build power.
Hers is just one of the many stories of queer people standing up for themselves, organizing, and winning their own rights in the face of impossible odds.
Right? It's like that feeling that you feel at Pride when you're like in the parade or in the marching in like an unofficial Pride parade, or like at a pride parade where you see so many other queer people and you feel so like, oh, this is so cool. There are so many of us. Like, we're so powerful. It is going to be that at scale. That's what we're doing. When people say pride was a riot, that is an organized action, right? So if we're talking about what is organizing, pride was organizing. The Stonewall riot, like, it was because like things had been festering and building, and it reached a boiling and breaking point that resulted in people who were wealthy being inconvenienced. And that was the like start, I take with air quotes, of the modern, right, queer liberation kind of movement. And so it's like the formula is there every time we look at it in history. It's about modernizing it to the current approach.
So often, marginalized people, especially women of color and queer people of color, have no choice but to engage in activism. They have no choice but to hold on to hope that the future can be made better. In my own anecdotal experience, it's typically only white kids who throw up their hands at the first sign of climate danger. But as I hope I've established in this episode, there is reason to be hopeful. Plenty of people have been thinking about a just transition for decades, or even centuries, from Indigenous leaders discussing land back and a Red New Deal, to Black leaders discussing reparations, environmental justice, and prison abolition. And there are already strikes happening all over the country for climate labor causes. In all labor movements throughout history, one of the most common union-busting tactics used by the people in power is to finance racism and fascism in the media to divide the working class. And unfortunately, that usually works, but we can't let it work anymore. Here's a fun fact for you. Martin Luther King was only considered a dangerous person by the government when he started forming interracial coalitions formed around class. Similarly, a big reason that the Black Panther Party was considered dangerous was because they were feeding kids with their breakfast program and proving that something like socialism could work in America. We look back on these important figures throughout history and we think, wow, they must have been superhumans for all that they were able to do. And as great as these people were, we have to remember that the people, with a capital P, mattered just as much.
So, and that's the thing. At the end of the day, I think the most important thing about organizing is remembering all of the people that we study about and whose tactics we read about and whose protests and marches and whatever, they were just people, just as much as you and me or anyone else that you know. If they are capable of that, that means that we are capable of that. If they are that incredibly powerful, that means that you yourself are that incredibly powerful. It's just about plugging into an alignment that enables you to maximize on it.
To quote one of my favorite memes, we're all literally just some guy. To put it another way, the great man theory of history is, in my mind, a flawed concept. As much as we need great leaders to step up, movements are enacted by communities, huge swaths of people, not individuals acting alone. So whether you fancy yourself a movement leader or you're just a movement foot soldier, know that you have a place here.
We talk about how like organizing was, my personal organizing was derived from like part of like my queerness. That's how, this plugging into this larger movement, I feel like our queer community is already so primed to be leaders in this space. And, what better way to dismantle the like bigotry of the right wing than the demonstrated public servanthood of the work that we are doing, right? Us, the public service of what we are doing in the community will dismantle beyond whatever rumors that they have. Because I know the majority of reasonable folks would be like, oh, well, I know someone who's trans and they're actually pretty cool. And they actually babysit my kids. So I don't know what you're talking about. Or like, I know this gay couple and they are so cute and their lawn is so perfect, or whatever, it may be, right? we, in this moment, stepping up to rise to meet the occasion as our identities come under attack and our living situation is crumbling, burning, crumbling, drowning, flooding, depending on your geography, wherever you are, beneath us, we're primed to like kind of like now or never. This is it. Let's go. So no pressure, but everyone needs to be a superhero immediately. All of the queer people, you know. I believe in the power of our community to really just, I mean, put a drag queen at the front. There's nothing we can't do. Truly.
Nothing we can't do.
Truly.
Hi, thanks so much for listening to this episode. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to us on Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Podcasts. It helps with the almighty algorithm if you leave us a review and share this episode with a few people who you think might like it. If you really like what you heard, consider becoming a Patreon supporter at patreon.com/rule63. That's patreon.com/RULE63, where you can get access to bonus content. For example, we have the full uncut interview with Shré, including their entire wonderful backstory and other funny moments. Here's a preview.
Do you know what slut bangs are?
Slut
like
bangs?
You know, like, okay, so like maybe it's just like my friend group that says this, but like, you know, if you like part your hair, or if you're putting your hair back in a ponytail and you just take from like the front and you have like the two little Azula strips, right? Framing your face, and it looks so hot and you're like, wow. With that, it's like, if that sits right on the day and you're just going outside to the coffee shop, it's like little moments of joy and expression to like being the person on the subway that like the kid is looking at with fascination, knowing that I once was that kid looking at someone on public transit being like, I don't know why I'm obsessed with you, but I am. And like looking back, it's like, oh, they were wildly, visibly queer.
Don't forget to connect with our gorgeous guest over on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. All their info is in the show notes. Okay, that's all I got for now. I will see you all next month for another Rule 63 episode where we're going to be talking about dating online while trans. Yay! Okay, bye!